evening. Thank you, everyone. And actually, I'm in Syracuse and we had 6 inches of snow today, which is no surprise to anyone. Thank you, Aaron, again. And thank you to the Mark Twain Library community for this series on truth, myth, and democracy, which is especially timely in the current climate here and in Europe. Also, thank you to the Reading League of Women Voters who work to empower voting and to defend democracy. And also thank you to all of the program sponsors. Welcome, Dr. Coleman, and welcome to all the members of our audience. To quote Mark Twain, the secret of getting ahead is to get started. So let's get started. So I'd like to provide a brief introduction to Dr. Coleman's career and body of work, although I understand that some of you may have read that in the promo. But here goes. It's difficult to do it concisely because of all of the things that he's done. His early life in the 1960s Chicago was tumultuous, and in his word, macro worrying, and a macro worrying time in history. Also, his early work with violent adolescents at an inpatient hospital led him to pursue graduate study at Columbia University, where he completed his PhD by studying how to use science to address societal ills, and where he worked with the prodigious Dr. Morton Deutsch. He initially was interested in mediation and negotiation practice when he finally turned towards researching big ideas proven out by science. Today, Dr. Coleman is a sought-after presenter, consultant, author of more than 100 articles and chapters, a number of seminal works, both scholarly and popular. He edits the award-winning Handbook of Conflict Resolution, Theory and Practice in its 3rd edition, which I was going to hand up and show you, but I was afraid I would tip over my coffee. It's so large. And I have used it in my teaching frequently. His work has also been featured in numerous media outlets, such as the New York Times, Harvard Business Review, Fox Business, and CBS, and other international outlets. He is a frequent blogger and radio broadcast contributor. As an academic, Dr. Coleman is a professor of psychology and education at Columbia with a joint appointment in the Teachers College and the Earth Institute. He directs the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution. He's the founding director of the Institute for Psychological Science and Practice. He's the co-executive director of Columbia's Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity. He has received numerous awards and honors for his life's work so far, including the 2018 Peace Award, from the Meaningful World, in celebration of their 30th anniversary and the UN's International Day of Peace. Among the 5 generations of conflict resolution specialists, Dr. Coleman has contributed to our understanding of conflict intelligence and systemic wisdom as meta competencies for navigating conflict constructively at all levels to increase daily positive and reciprocal interactions at the personal, local, national, and global levels, something we all need so much. I am proud and happy to be here today. Thank you for joining us. And on a final note of introduction, as events are unfolding in Ukraine and in Europe over these last couple of weeks, I have revised some of my questions to reflect this new, most current reality. I will ask questions for about an hour, and then we'll turn to the audience and hear their questions. So my first question is, throughout your career, you discuss the importance of data-driven practice and scientific research. Especially now, why are research and data so important in your work and to the field of conflict resolution?
Well, thank you very much, Averell, for that generous introduction. One of my favorites. It's a great story you tell. I keep thinking, who is that person? So I appreciate it. And yes, I'm sitting right now in my office, which is in the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution at Columbia University. Mort founded this center in 1986. He had just retired, and the mandate of the center gets to your question. The mandate of this Mort created. So Mort Deutsch was an eminent theorist and scholar, and one of the most influential psychologists of all time, particularly in terms of peace psychology and issues of social justice. But was also a practitioner, was a clinical therapist, was a psychoanalytic therapist, And so he did a lot of practice with individuals and couples, and founded this center as a science practice center. Our mandate is to really try to keep, science relevant to practice and practice relevant to science. So that's, really our business here. So our handbook, our conflict resolution, summarizes areas of theory and research and says, this is what it means to you today if you have to mediate a conflict, or you want to negotiate something, or you're dealing with an intergroup problem. So we try to keep science as relevant to practice, and practice, learning from practice and gleaning insights from practice to science. One of the reasons we work that so hard is because there is a general tendency, and this is true in all applied sciences. This is true in medicine, it's true in consulting and education, but there is a general tendency for academic work and practical work to just drift apart. At the turn of the last century, around 1914, there was a report put out called the Flexner Report, which was a kind of a bombshell in medicine, because it was basically saying that you had, medical doctors going to school and then going off and practicing and never paying any attention to science again. And so they would do their practice, and research was being conducted, but it was oftentimes disconnected from clinical practice. And so it really outed medicine at that time as this place that was not paying close attention to current advances in science. The same was true. The Hewlett Foundation did a similar kind of outing of our field in the late 1990s, and did a big report saying the same thing, that you have a lot of practitioners doing good practice, but really becoming more and more estranged from or distant from scientific research. You have a lot of scientists that are doing research, but not necessarily research that has practical implications, or they're not, at least not making that connection. So we actually started, our first handbook of conflict resolution was published in 2000, and we started it based on a group of practitioners and academics sitting around a table and asking hard questions. I remember Ellen Rader, who was a mediator and worked a lot in schools, and she said to one of my colleagues, an academic here, who was talking about his research on attribution theory, and Ellen said, great. She said, so I have to go mediate a gang conflict tomorrow in Staten Island. How is your theory or findings useful to me tomorrow? And he said, well, I don't know. I don't know. I haven't really thought about it, And so it was those kinds of conversations that began to encourage us to try to be much more rigorous in translating science and practice. And so, yes, that's what the center was built on. That's how I came here and went to school, studied with Deutsch, became director of this place in 1998. And so that's been our primary mandate, is to try to keep science useful, right? And try to keep practice informed by science, because otherwise it loses its edge and it loses its efficacy.
And I mentioned the 5 generations of conflict resolvers. And I think it's also, because we're relatively a new field, it's really given legitimacy to us. People like you and your work have really made us into more of a hard science. I mean, we're a soft science, but it's really increased the importance of the field, in my view.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, yes, we are a social science, but what's interesting too is just social science is becoming, I would say, harder and harder in terms of its science. I work in teams. In the projects I do, I work in multidisciplinary teams. And so I oftentimes work with mathematicians, data scientists, modelers, who are stealing everything they can from physics and chemistry and biology in terms of thinking about things in ways that are similar to biological processes, but then can translate to conflict processes and social processes. So, more and more data science, hard data, mathematical modeling is informing how we think about what we do, even the sort of practice of what we do. So there is, yes, it is considered a soft science or a social science. But I have to say, Mark Deutsch pushed back on that. When he was originally offered a job, he was originally offered a job when he came out of Bell Labs at Yale, at Columbia University across the street in psychology or here at Teachers College. And he said, and they made this distinction that over there was basic science and over here it's applied science. And he said, you know, sort of phooey, I don't believe in that distinction. I think what we do here is we tackle important social problems, but we bring the best systematic empirical science to bear in understanding those problems and understanding the conditions under which they change. And he really made that case, drove that case home, that this isn't, you know, just applied or just soft. This is the best science we have applied to social problems.
I agree. I also, the quantitative and the qualitative both have so much to offer that they really, the storytelling of the qualitative can't be, I mean, it's about the human being, the human condition after all.
And we're learning that more and more. Let me just say quickly, in
Absolutely.
data science has these fantastic, extremely powerful tools. But what I'm learning and working with data scientists is that, you know, they can sort of come up with a model that's highly predictive, but they have no idea why, right? Unless they work with social scientists, and oftentimes grounded social scientists, anthropologists, you know, people that have local cultural knowledge. They really need them in order to understand the algorithms and what the patterns are telling them, right? So more and more, the need for both of those is critical.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So in your view, and at a time like this, what are the most important contributions of the 3 programs that you direct to the field of conflict resolution? And can you tell us if they have any direct involvement currently in events in Ukraine?
So the question is, what are the 3 most important?
No, so that you're a director or co-director of 3 centers. And can you tell me in a nutshell, although I know that's a big nutshell, what are the contributions, the most important that you see for the field of conflict resolution? And then kind of asking for insider information, are you specifically on the ground, involved in anything going on in Ukraine right now? But maybe you can't say.
So I'm not directly involved in the Ukraine right now. That's, you know, I work in a lot of different domains. I do sometimes work in international conflicts or in international nations in conflicts. But I always work very closely with local partners on the ground. I will say that one of the partners that I work with frequently is a man named Andrea Bartoli. And Andrea he's an anthropologist, and he was at Columbia, and then he was the dean of the School of Conflict Analysis at George Mason, and then went on elsewhere. But he's also a world-class peacemaker, and so he's a very grounded peacemaker, and he works with a group called the Community of San Egidio, which is it's the Roman Catholic NGO that mostly works with dealing with extreme poverty. But because they're in dangerous places around the world, often conflict zones, they're oftentimes sought out because they're trusted, and they oftentimes don't have an agenda other than trying to reduce violence. So he's been involved in many processes. He's currently directly involved in South Sudan in helping through the Vatican broker negotiations there. But he told me a story. I was on a call with him last week about, which was relevant to Ukraine, which I thought was one of the few bright spots that I've heard of. And that is that the Pope, the current Pope, Pope Francis, woke up the day that the news about the invasion hit, and immediately felt, sorrow and the need to act, and knew that he couldn't get to Moscow and couldn't get to Kyiv, and that wasn't realistic. So he got in a car and he drove across the street, and he went to the Russian embassy, and he asked for an immediate meeting with the Russian ambassador, and who, of course, granted it. And he walked into the office and he said, "We need to begin back channel negotiations immediately. We have to do everything we can to put an end to this violence as soon as we can." So, for me, so the Pope is a head of state, right? Vatican City is a state, and he's the head of a church, and he's He's also a very iconoclastic pope. He's not a traditional pope. This kind of movement, motion, gesture, very, provocative, let's say, from a pope, and very promising, because it is these kinds of things. I mean, a constellation of things are necessary, and I'm sure your listening audience is familiar with the pressure campaigns that are happening around sanctions, and both bottom up and top down, right? The EU and Canada and UK and US have come together for economic sanctions and are trying to put pressure on there. But there are also extraordinary stories coming out about individuals that are doing things. So one of the things I heard yesterday was that $2 million have gotten directly to Ukrainians through Airbnb. That individuals are renting Airbnbs for months at a time and just sending money so that it can get in and to help local people. There was also a young man who's created a website called something like Oligarchs Yachts, and it's tracking the jet planes and yachts of these top oligarchs and just communicating where these people are, where they're traveling. So again, what's kind of extraordinary about our days, this doesn't necessarily get to your question, but it is that there is this potential for extraordinary impact from individuals, from groups, and through this ecosystem, that this interdependent ecosystem that we have through things like Airbnb, right? So there's a lot of promising things. But symbolic gestures such as, not only symbolic, I would say, what the Pope did was transcended symbolic, because it's practical, it's realistic. He has the good offices to gather people together from different nations and begin conversations if they're not happening, or contribute to those. So, in terms of my work in the Ukraine, I don't really work directly in the Ukraine. One of the things we'll probably talk about is the US and the division here. And I do say what's happening in the Ukraine and in Europe right now is both a harbinger of possible things to come here, and also is an opportunity for Americans to reflect and reset and look at our own discourse and our own politics and our own tendencies towards authoritarianism, or even extreme pluralism, and look at some of the challenges of that. So, one of the things, again, I am directly involved.
To value our democracy.
Value our democracy, recognize that despite all its flaws, it is still a fairly functional democracy, even though we were downgraded recently into a flawed democracy for good reason. But again, I think what we're seeing, in some ways, war for many in the West is something that for the history books. And what we're seeing every day, every moment right now are the horrors of war and what happens when diplomacy and talking and negotiations fail. And so that, I think, just stresses the critical importance of the work that you do and that our colleagues do.
Absolutely. A quick question, because I just found this comment so intriguing. In the Handbook of Conflict Resolution, you make the comment that creativity requires conflict. What do you mean by that?
So conflict gets, typically a bad reputation. People get anxious in conflict. They remember the negative conflicts they've had, the harms that they've suffered or inflicted. And so most of us do have this, repulsion to conflict. And one of the things that Mark tried to do in his career was really challenge that and say, look, life without conflict would be tremendously boring. Right? I mean, every novel, every movie, every play, every opera has conflict as its main driver, right? And the truth is that we as human beings don't learn without conflict. We see the world in a certain way, and then somebody introduces a provocative theory or piece of research or just idea that challenges us. That's can be destabilizing and conflictual within us. That's how we learn. Our relationships, our intimacy with one another oftentimes can be enhanced through conflict. Social justice only happens through conflict, through marching in the streets, hopefully, or other forms of conflict. So, And it's interesting, I've just been watching the documentary of the Beatles called Get Back, which is, 60 hours or something, and they've boiled down to about 7 hours. And, it's at a phase in their life of their careers that where they were very distressed. And there was a ton of conflict, but a lot of the conflict is creative,
generated some of their best songs,
and it would push them a little further. And they would say that, and Monty Python has talked about that, and others have talked about that it's oftentimes you get somebody has an idea and somebody pushes back and somebody comes in with a third idea, and none of them are good enough, and through that tension a new idea is born, right? And that's such an extraordinary process. That's the creative process. And, it really doesn't happen without that. Again, you can have extremely creative people who go off themselves and create new things, but they're filled with internal conflict of their mindsets and their paradigms, and then breaking them and challenging them, and how destabilizing, unsettling that is, until there's a new insight. So it's a critical aspect of all of those positive sides of nature, of human relations, creativity, innovation, and intimacy, right?
It's both inescapable and essential.
Yeah, well, more
I've
like
had 10 or 12 conflicts just today.
I'm sorry?
I've had 10 or 12 conflicts just today, inside and outside. Who gets the last bowl of Cheerios? I mean, it's it's absolutely inescapable.
Right, and those are scarce resources, right? Those are important.
Exactly right. That's exactly right.
Mort liked to use the metaphor for conflict of sex, right? He said, look, conflict is as natural to our species as sex. It's fundamental to our species. And we don't, again, learn or create, or, and the pathologies are very similar, right? The obsessions or other kinds of pathologies. So it's a perfect metaphor, because conflict is a pervasive part of our life, our being, our state. And without it, as I said, life would be pretty tedious.
Although I'd like to change that to eating, because people can live without sex. People can live their entire life and never have had sex, but they can't live without eating. So maybe eating would be is as good a metaphor as that.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Although we wouldn't live very long without sex, right? Because we need that for
the population. That's right. So I was thinking that's right.
Right.
You're absolutely right. You're right. So I teach a course on mediation and third-party intervention, and at that time I read your chapter on power and conflict. And one of the things that you said at the end, and that I really liked about the handbook, is that you said it's essential to teach students about the importance of power differences in conflict resolution. I took that to heart and designed a simulation called Power Play, which I use forever, and had many students come back to me and say that they remembered vividly about the significance of power and the various different types of power. So tell us a little bit about your early work on power and conflict, and how you might relate it to Presidents Putin and Biden and the people on the ground. And I understand maybe you said that that's not, European politics may not be your thing so much. So tell us a little bit about that work.
So I started thinking about this. Frankly, it was the conclusion of this book, which is Mort Deutsch's, one of his most important consequential books, The Resolution of Conflict. And in the very last page of this, in the conclusion, he basically says, I've been, at this point trying to offer, he said, as I review this, where I function as a self-appointed consultant to those in low power, I'm struck by how little of what I've said is well-grounded in systematic research or theory. Social scientists have rarely directed their attention to and this is important, to the defensiveness and resistance of the strong and powerful in the face of the need for social change. They've not considered what strategies and tactics are available to low power groups, and which of these are likely to lead to productive rather than destructive processes, and so on. So I read that as a graduate student and said, that is the question, right? Like, how do you work with people who are in power, who are clueless or paying no attention, or, living a sort of, life in a bubble? How do you negotiate with them effectively? How do you work with them effectively? So my dissertation was on something called implicit theories of power. And this is relevant, I think, to Putin and to Biden. And that the study was that people basically there are essentially two different types of implicit theories of power. Implicit theories are just, theories that we have that we use to understand the world. But oftentimes we don't really articulate them or think about them. Some of us think of power as a fixed pie. If I empower you, I lose a little control over you. I lose status, I lose something, right? And that is a basic theory that many people operate on. Others view power, like, for example, Mary Parker Follett. She's one of the first people to say this. She was an American social worker and that wrote in the 1920s, very influential woman at the time. And she said,
and one of the few women in the field that really have been recognized for their contribution.
Was shaped integrative negotiation, power sharing, team building, organizational behavior. She was a pioneer in thinking in all of those domains. But she was one of the ones to say, yeah, well, it's true. And she was working at a time when there was a lot of violent strife around unionization in business and industry. And she said it's true that in business and industry, you see a lot of dominance and oppression and kind of coercive use of power. She said, but one way to keep that in check is to grow a very different kind of power dynamic. And that's what she said is what she called genuine power, which is the capacity for us all to benefit from sharing responsibilities and making decisions together and the value of that. She said, if you create that culture, then you reduce the need for the other. So she had a very provocative perspective at the time. And that's what I basically did is I developed a measure to assess whether people implicitly thought about power as a fixed pie competitive dynamic, or that power was something that you could grow. And if you shared it, it would actually enhance your capacities to be functional. And those two things led to very different kinds of decision-making processes, conflict resolution processes. So that was the first thing I did. But I will say that if I fast forward ahead, one of the other reasons why I eventually wrote a book called Making Conflict Work, which is about power differences in organizations and how to navigate them.
I have your app. I have the app.
Oh, fantastic. Great.
It's very clever. The app is very clever.
Thank you. I'm glad. Yes, I think it's useful. What the reason I wrote this book and started working in this area is because the center had worked with the United Nations for about 20 years in offering negotiation, mediation trainings and that type of thing through, at a lot of different levels. One of my students had been hired to implement those programs in their international field duty stations. And we'd worked with the UN very closely to get cases that were relevant to them in the trainings. And, but one of the primary cases that kept coming up was a case of the supervisor and supervisee at the UN. And the UN is a highly hierarchical place. It's a high power distance place. If you work at the UN, you know everybody's status and position above and below you, right? And if you ask anybody at the UN why the UN doesn't work, they'll say, they don't know what they're doing. We're great. They just can't get it together. And that goes all the way up to the general secretary who points at Congress and says they won't pay the bills. So there's a lot of conflict around hierarchy. And in that context, our trainings, our integrative negotiation mediation trainings would fail because people know when you're high power, low power, how to do that conflict at the UN. And it's basically, you do, those in high power say, do as I tell you to do, right? And those in low power are peevish and angry and frustrated all the time. And so negotiating across that was a big problem. So this student of mine, Christopher Lowe, called me at some point with one of those, Houston, we have a problem calls. And so we're doing these trainings all over the world, but when we get to this simulation, it derails the integrity and the legitimacy of all negotiations. Because if you can't negotiate up and down in the UN, what's the point of this, right? That's where the problems are. And so we started to do research on that. How do you effectively, when there are power differences, negotiate up, negotiate down, when you have a former, supervisee who is now your supervisor. How do you adapt to that and change? And so that became a critical lens through which we were trying to understand the value of integrative negotiation and mediation. Is how do you do that when there are vast power differences?
And one of the things I thought that was interesting about that book, Peter, was that you provide high power, low power, low power, low power, high power, low power, high, so that you essentially offer advice for all of the various different power relationships that we might encounter in our lives, which is one of the things that I think makes that book really useful.
Yeah, that's what we were trying to do. Again, is just, again, what Moore did in cooperation and competition was very theoretically and empirically very important. And its use in integrative negotiation or distributive bargaining was fine and useful and great in many settings. But when suddenly you're negotiating up, your options change, your possibilities change, how you feel change, what's at risk changes. And when you're negotiating down as well, there are different kinds of dynamics. And power
in our lives, we are confronted with every single type of power situation, whether sometimes I have to negotiate with people who have higher power or lower power or equal power. And so it's important to have, to understand what you need to do in each of those situations.
Absolutely. And as your children grow, right, from infants to toddlers to, 11-year-olds to 15-year-olds to 25-year-olds, the power.
To my 95-year-old father, who I negotiate now with very, very differently than when I was 14.
Absolutely,
yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So having some framework to understand what happens to you when those power dynamics change, and then what are your options that are more effective options. That's really what we, have studied for 20 years and have tried to put out in this book, because nobody read the articles or the science articles, but then in the app, right? The app came because I was teaching this book at the Harvard Kennedy School to a bunch of diplomats, and one of them screamed out, "Oh, you have to create an app for that." And I thought, that's interesting. I have no idea what that means.
I want to turn to intractability, but I want to ask you, will there be the Way Out app?
Yes, there.
I had a feeling. I really did have a feeling, because the content lends itself to it.
Yes, we are in the process of working with two colleagues who are generating a series of apps for different models. One that we've just designed is on what we call adaptive mediation, which is, mediation presents certain derailers. That means that you either deal with those problems or you stop mediation.
Like power differences.
Sorry?
Like power differences.
Well, power differences can be one, but it's mostly like high intensity conflicts that feel unsafe. It's covert issues that nobody will talk about. It's extremely competitive dynamics. Yeah. So there are these kind of four derailers that our research has identified. And then there are adaptive strategies that help you manage those. So we've just created an app that hopefully it'll be out in a couple of months, because, these things take time on that. And then the plan is to move to an app for the Way Out, because it is offering us, some simple distinctions that a simple app, I find the simpler the apps, the better. You want something on your phone that if I'm going to go into a negotiation right now, or I'm stuck in a mediation and I don't know what to do, or I'm about to talk to my brother-in-law who's a dyed-in-the-wool, Trumper or anti-Trumper, and I have to deal with that I can get some useful advice, in about 40 seconds.
Absolutely. Yeah, 40 seconds is long even. So let's talk about intractability. And so your new book is called How to Overcome Toxic Polarization. And one of the things that I wanted to talk a little bit about, but I'm trying to really keep track of our time here. You have the Difficult Conversations Lab, and you've done some really good research on that, that you founded that lab that's studying at Columbia. And I wanted to ask you that, what is advice to have a difficult conversation with a loved one versus an extreme opponent? And then I move on to talk a little bit about a couple of other difficult conversations and polarization in our country.
Okay, sounds great. Yes. So some advice I would have a bit, so again, it depends on what the conflict is. because most of the time, many times, sitting down with somebody who you have a relationship with, right, who you know, and talking things out is the best way to do it, right? That should be your default. But under times like this, where political divisions are not just between two people, but they're also connected to our networks and the media we watch and the places we vacation or don't vacation and the algorithms that sort us on the internet, there's a constellation of things that create these divides where the passions are deep. And in those situations, just sitting down with someone on the other side who is a pro or anti, vehement pro or anti-Trumper, oftentimes backfires. And what Pew tells us is that, just reaching out to people to have those conversations these days seems to do more harm than good, because people leave more frustrated, more alienated, and more angry. So what I say to people is that if you're going to sit down with someone who you have a relationship with, and you have some sense of that relationship, the first thing you just want to do is ask yourself, what do I hope to achieve here, right? Is it that I want to shame them and attack them? Is that really what I want to do? And
change their mind?
Is that working, right? Or is that even possible or feasible? And if not, then my recommendation is you take a different track. One of the things I talk about in the way out is that in America, our default to talk about politics is debate. We think that's the way to the truth, right? You make a claim, I find the flaws in it and come back with a counterpoint, and that's our legal system, that's our political system. We're trained in that in high school. Debate is the key. And when these kinds of conflicts are straining relationships, people become estranged from one another, then jumping into a political debate over any issue is a mistake.
It's not going to be effective.
It's not going to be effective.
And in fact, it's going to be destructive. It's
going to trigger. And that's what we're seeing all the time. That 50% of Americans have divides in their own families right now. So it's something that's seeping all the way down. And part of it is because we're socialized to think that debate is the right way to engage and communicate around political differences. And again, oftentimes they are, and that can be a very functional process under certain rules. But the distinction I offer is dialogue. Debate is a process of winning a game, right? It's a kind of closed communication process where I want to be right. I want to prove to you I'm right. I want to make you wrong in order to prove I'm right. And it is sort of a game of making points. That's kind of how it's organized in our brains. Dialogue.
It's kind of a weird metaphor, but it reminds me of the difference between football versus soccer, where soccer is a teamwork game, and it's us working together to score in very low scoring games, as opposed to football, which is two opponents that they're bashing their heads together, trying to take their territory. So I think the difference between dialogue and debate.
Yeah, I think that's true. Dialogue is the opposite of debate in that it's a process of discovery and learning. Right. It's not a process of winning. It's not a process of persuasion. It is a process where if I'm in dialogue with someone, I may learn things about my own attitude or position or understanding of an issue that I didn't know, right?
Right, gaining knowledge and understanding. That's right.
Of my own assumptions and what I'm bringing to this, of the issues and the complexity and nuance of the issues that we're talking about, and of the other side, and what matters to them. I learn and discover. That kind of communication is not common in America. You see it in AA meetings, you see it in Quaker meetings, you see it in certain spaces where people open up and share, but it's not something that we're socialized to do oftentimes. And
in
it's
our culture.
And there's very, very scarce place for that on the internet, on the major social media platforms.
And in fact, you argue that social media and the media are designed, in fact, to inflate our differences. And that was one of the things I wanted to talk about. Elon Musk just sent Starlink systems to Ukraine. And I want to stay domestic for the rest of our conversation, but the media and social media are designed to make our differences more exaggerated and to because even Facebook. I mean, the research that's come out about Facebook and how They want you to stay inflamed, to stay connected, that people continue to swipe if they're, and so that's a very difficult challenge in this 24-hour media cycle that we have, and with the influence of platforms like like Instagram and like TikTok, and I mean even TikTok lately, there have been some limits and discussions about how there should be some limits. So that's a real problem.
It's a baked in problem, because it's the business model of both social media and a lot of mainstream media. The business model is outrage and addiction, which is an addictive substance, right? There's brain research that shows that when you experience outrage, when you have a taste for retaliation, it lights up the pleasure centers in your brain that heroin lights up, right? Mm-hmm. So there are addictive qualities here. And the business models know that, that these businesses understand that. They want these products to be as addictive as possible. They do everything they can to increase the addictive qualities of them. And I have to say, the irony of mainstream media and journalism is that it didn't, TV news used to be boring. It used to be a public service. It made no money. And then 60 Minutes came along and as an investigative news show made money. And suddenly the producers were like, hey, we can make money on news. So then it was the entertainmentization of news. And part of what, again, is clickbait in an era where attention is a scarce resource, are the most provocative things. Those are happening in most of our communication spheres. And that's a huge contributor to, it's someone once said, I think Lisa Church said that social media isn't the accelerant that we're pouring on polarization, that there are differences there and they matter to people, but social media is just pouring gasoline on the flame.
And I think, one of the things that you've said is that we each need to look at what each of us are doing to contribute to that. And make and this is one of the points that you make in the book, is that I need to choose to dialogue instead of debate. I need to choose to turn off my social media, to stop swiping when it's toxic. And that it's like Margaret Mead said, it takes individuals to make these choices. I want to ask you about a pretty specific issue that in fact is somewhat relevant to the Reading Easton district, and the January Mark Twain conversation with Dr. Anthea Butler, which was really just wonderful. She talked about the fact that African-American people are exhausted and that white people need to do more to step up. And I feel the same way about women's issues as well. It's, women's issues, they're men's issues. Racism is a white person's issue. And so with the critical race theory being under attack all over the country, there have been more books banned in the last few months than in the last several years. Yeah. And in this district where the Mark Twain Library exists, there's been a very well-funded campaign to curtail any curriculum that promotes inclusivity and social justice, and pushback by outspoken opponents of this type of curriculum. What kind of strategies would you recommend specifically for that issue?
Well, that's a great question. And again, these kinds of issues are simply weaponized as part of the broader cultural divide, right? Because many of these things are collapsing around these kind of right-left issues. But again, this, but critical race theory is not that term has now been weaponized to indicate things that it was never meant originally to mean, right? It's a legal theory, right, that you study in law school, but it's bloomed into this thing and then become weaponized by the right as a way to, basically mobilize parents, in school, at the school level politically. So the bigger problem is, certainly racism and the legacy of white supremacy in this country, but that because of the political polarization we're in, everything is weaponized, right? And everything is fair game. In fact, you even saw that initially with Ukraine, right? With some of the more insane right-wingers sort of saying, well, Putin's a good guy, and I think this is a smart thing to do, and so it is like everything is fair game and becomes weaponized. But in terms of what I would recommend for example, communities to do. So the first question I would ask in a community is, are there groups or individuals in the community that are trusted to broker these conversations, right? So there may be groups already there that are local community groups. And if you go to the website Bridging Divides Initiative, which is out of Princeton, it's called the Bridging Divides Initiative. There's a map of America, and it's an interactive map, and you can zoom in.
I looked at that. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, you zoom in on your community, and you
In
see.
fact, I recently moved back to Syracuse, and I actually used it to check out things in my own community here. Yeah,
That's such a fantastic resource, and my point is that these kinds of conversations, there are people are intentionally whipping up, certainly one side, but that triggers the other side. So they're not actual conversations. There are spaces that are trying to have conversations that are more reasonable conversations. And you can find those on the Bridging Divides Initiative in your community. So my recommendation for a mayor or for a council person who's really interested,
school board member,
or a school board member that really wants to look into how do we shift this dynamic, you start with the people that know how to do that. Because again, this is in a public setting. This is not something that's going to be easy to do, right? There's just too much else that's instigating it. So I would say, look to the people that know how to do it or are doing it, and see if there's a way to scale up the impact of what they're already doing, as opposed to trying something new. Try something that already works and make that more available, more pervasive, more recognized.
Yeah, and you did make that point in the way out that we need to depend on what is already working on the ground, not reinventing the wheel, but see who is being successful and then how we capitalize on that. That's I think that's really very good advice. And I you published in Time Magazine on January 6th, this year, an article that talked about the prospect of civil war in this country. And I just wanted to, I was concerned about even asking this question because it feels like it's asking, middle schoolers, do you smoke cigarettes? And then you give them the idea that maybe they could, I did some social research years ago. True. So I was afraid to even ask this question, but I felt like I needed to, particularly with what happened on January 6th. And so how do you feel about that? And what will prevent that from happening? Although I think, this book talks a lot about ideas that will do that.
So you're right. Even talking about it is a moral dilemma, because you're right. And I noticed that there are certain periodicals and conversations that don't go there, that just really don't name that. And I understand that. On the other hand, there are people like John Meacham, George Kearns Goodwin, who are American historians, who are saying this is just like the 1850s. There's a secessionist movement, there's a major disinformation campaign, there's a contested election. This is the alchemy of war. And we're a country with something like 400 million guns, right? We're saturated with guns. So this is a place where that is a not unimaginable scenario. And so we have to take that seriously. Again, I agree with you that we don't want to trigger that, but we have to be mindful of that. And that's one of the reasons I wrote this book.
In my entire career that there would never be another ground war in West Europe. And there are many in Europe, and there are many theories to support that. So it's a scary prospect.
It's a scary prospect, and it is a scary prospect here. Again, my one hope, one slight, silver lining around Ukraine is that we look at that and say, yeah, we don't want to do that, right? We don't want to go anywhere near that. And so the fantasy that people have that are dressing in fatigues with automatic rifles and thinking, oh, let's go to war, if they look at the women and children that are slaughtered in the streets, maybe it will give them pause. Because I do believe that most humans, most Americans have a decent side, have a side that can be moved. And these images are horrible.
And that
and
peace is, sustainable peace is where our survival lies. I mean, that's the reality of it. If you look at survival of the fittest in a little different way, that solution tools, the hearing each other, dialoguing, the avoiding violence, that is where the species will survive, not activating the nuclear arsenal and not, killing each other in the streets because we disagree about school curriculum.
Averell, you probably know this, and maybe this is the whole other conversation, but one of the projects we have here is on studying sustainably peaceful societies. I put together a multidisciplinary team to do that for about 10 years. And, because there's a ton that you can learn from societies that in 1948 said, we're not going to do this anymore. We're going to divest our military or put it into other, put the resources into other things. We're going to have peace education in every school, and we're going to grow a peaceful society that can tolerate difference and can work, negotiate differences. That's possible, and understanding how that happens is the key, because it's one thing to have harbingers of pain and misery like the Ukraine. It's another thing to realize that that isn't necessarily where we have to end up. And so many humans really believe that we're fundamentally territorial and animal and, antagonistic. Well, that's not what the research tells us. The research tells us that human beings were on this planet for 1.5 million years before we ever warred, right? So it's not hard baked into our DNA.
That our peacefulness is as innate as many claim the violence is.
Collaboration, cooperation, and needing each other is fundamental to the human species. We would not be here if we didn't have it.
That's right. But
we've created conditions of inequality and, scarce resources and envy and status. These conditions, societal conditions and social conditions that we've created, are the drivers of envy and attack. And so, we have to take a hard look at our cultures, right? And what we're promoting and what we're incentivizing and why. Why are the social media platforms principally about competition and coercion and provocation? Why is that the main thing? Well, it's because it's low-hanging fruit, it's addictive, they know it, and they've made a lot of money. Okay, how much more money do you need, Zuckerberg? You've got enough. It's time to create an alternative that isn't feeding on our basest instincts.
And I so agree with you, Peter. And I think each of us every day need to make different decisions about what we want our country to be like, what we want our world to be like, what we want to teach our children, what kind of curriculum, that we need to be teaching this in kindergarten and every year after that. So I really feel strongly, and I think it's one of the things that I really like about your work is you talk about individual responsibility. What am I doing today? What am I going to do tomorrow to make choices differently, to have our world be different, and to not become, that heroin addict with violence?
Yeah, we have some efficacy ourselves, even though this is an overwhelming set of factors that it's operating on us. We can make decisions and choices. The book tries to culminate in a set of what I call new rules. These are slight nudges that you can do tomorrow morning when you wake up to make different choices, or to at least ask yourself the question, do I want to engage this way, or do I want to reset and do it differently? I have to say I'm in conversations with a group that's working with SNAP, and hopefully they're going to start to share some of these nudges, particularly with younger people like Gen Zs who are on these social media platforms, to offer and encourage them to share. How do they complicate their life? How do they, move with other people in ways that connect them? And if they can begin to share these, we want to build this huge mosaic of young people saying, this is how we do this. We do it every day. You can do it too.
Yes, one of my students have said, I'm so idealistic about global peace and and cosmopolitan, all that. And I say, they say, we're never going to get there. And I say, grains of sand make a beach. Make a beach, drops of water make a river. So that's what we've got to remind ourselves, that it's every little act of kindness and every moment of success that we have having a dialogue with someone who we loathe what they believe, but we understand that they're a person too, and that maybe I can learn something from them.
Yeah.
So yeah, that sounds like a really good initiative. And what are some of the other recommendations in the book? We've only got a couple of minutes left before we take questions from the audience.
Well, I do want to say that it's hard work. You know, I mean, again, I'm optimistic. I am optimistic about the human species. I'm optimistic about America. I'm optimistic about our ability to work through this. We've been in places like this before. We had a civil war, right? So I am optimistic that we can come out of it. But I also, you know, I end the book. My daughter read this book and said, I love the book a lot, but the last chapter was hard, because what I say is, there are no quick fixes for this. You know, you can take responsibility for your life, but ultimately it is about building alliances and allegiances with others and taking on some of these issues in ways that you can, like only I can, right? We all have to ask that question: what can my neighbors and I do? What can I do at Columbia University? What can you do elsewhere? What can I do in a particular community to, you know, lower the temperature and increase the chances of people humanizing each other? You know, one of the places I point out in the book in the last chapter is a place in upstate New York called Watertown, New York. And Watertown, New York is in the center of Trump country. It went to Trump.
Watertown.
Sorry? Watertown. Yeah.
Yes, where the 10th Mountain Division is.
Exactly.
Yes.
It's, as I said, middle of Trump country, went to Trump by many, points, I think 20 points and then 30 points in the last election, and is in the 1% of the most politically tolerant counties in the country. And so the question is, why is that? There was a great story by Amanda Ripley in The Atlantic that profiled that place. And they found that it's because they are very intentional about bringing people together for Monday breakfast. They have 25% mixed Republican Democratic marriages. They also have isolated or insulated their local politics from the national parties. They don't let the national parties fund and control them. They have their own. So they, there are bright spots. There are places across this country that are better at tolerating one another, and we can learn from them.
Well, and one of the things I did find, I'm glad you talk about optimism, and the Dalai Lama came to my school some years ago, and one of the questions that I asked, that was one of the questions that was asked was, how do you feel about the future? And I was thinking he was going to say horribly, and he said optimistic, and it's because I wake up every morning and I choose that frame. And so one of the things I liked about the last chapter was your idea about complicate your life. You know, it's not, we've oversimplified these issues. I have way more in common with those people I disagree with than I have different. And I said to my students, then we'll see how much we have in common. I mean, seriously, we all breathe, we all have teeth. Well, we all wear socks. I mean, we have so much in common. And so that's the idea that we need to complicate our lives. And just as you said, it's not going to be simple, but it's going to be satisfying as all get out when we are able to see that we have the power to make things better. Yeah.
Well, we see the alternative. We see an alternative path in Ukraine and Russia right now, and that is we definitely want to move in the opposite direction.
Somebody just said, put the title of the book in the chat.
Oh, okay.
So it's The Way Out, How to Overcome Toxic Polarization. That's not putting it in the chat, but hopefully that will be sufficient. Okay, so I want to take some questions. Last thing you said, I'm sorry, I got distracted by reading the chat. The first rule of listening is don't. So what was the last thing you said, Peter?
I just said that what's happening in the Ukraine, again, is an alternative path that we don't want to even imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the 2 million refugees. Yeah, just okay. So let me see. Here is a long question that is, let's see. Sorry, that one. Okay.
That's all right.
One of the largest contributors towards toxic polarization is called stacked sorting. For instance, where people fall on the liberal conservative spectrum, aligned with their neighborhoods, bars and restaurants, which is the opposite of what you were just describing in Watertown.
Yeah.
Stacked sorting has decreased the likelihood that people will interact in a meaningful way. What are your thoughts on the obstacles created by such stacked sorting? And have you encountered this in your own work? If so, are there particular strategies that you have used and or could suggest in such a context?
Yeah.
And to the audience, by the way, thank you for your attention and send along your questions. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, so what stacked sorting is it's the opposite of what we call cross-cutting structures, which is public spaces or private spaces where people of difference come together, grow up together, their kids grow up together, et cetera. And yes, there are policies and ideas that we're looking at that I think could be helpful in this. Let me just quickly say two. So I talk about it in the book, I talk about Botswana as an example. Botswana was a colony, became independent about the same time as Angola and Mozambique became independent. And Angola and Mozambique broke out into interethnic warfare. And Botswana was very concerned that the same thing would happen because they had, tribes that disliked or hated one another, that had been forced to live together. And under this new independence, they were afraid that war would break out. So they came up with a policy which they claim contributes to their lack of violence between ethnic groups and to their prosperity to this day. It's one of the most peaceful and prosperous nations in Africa. And that is that civil servants, which make up, I think, almost 50% of the working population, which are doctors and lawyers and teachers and engineers, civil servants are required every 7 years to get up and move them and maybe their families to different tribal regions in Botswana. So they can't live all their life within their homogeneous tribe. They need to become ambassadors. And so you have the civil servants of the country moving and living for 7 years, which, it takes a while to build rapport and trust and connection to other people. But they believe, as inconvenient as that is in people's lives, that it's been a critical source of mixing up ethnic tribes so that they get to know and humanize each other and have these, common bonds and contact. Let me say that I'm going to a retreat in a couple of weeks that the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation is putting on, and they're looking at how to work with all of the service organizations in America, all of the various service organizations, for young people and others. And how do we start to integrate insights into bridge building and contact, conflict resolution, into the training and into the structure of these programs so that we can work, you don't have to create new programs, but work with existing programs where people are already traveling to other parts of the country and, Teach for America and places, you go there for a year or two. So how do you build in bridge building into a core component of that? To me, it's a parallel idea to what Botswana did. It's just working with an existing set of programs.
I wanted to ask you about that because in preparing for this, your name has popped up so many places. The Greater Good Science newsletter is one that I just love. And you wrote an article there about locomotion and about the importance of movement as a conflict resolution tool, which I just love that idea. And I had wanted to ask you, what are some ways that we can do more of that in our culture? Because, I thought the Botswana idea was just so wonderful. So I do like that idea of Teach Across America and the things that we have in place already that are movements. I think that's just a wonderful idea.
Yeah,
really wonderful.
Great.
Okay, let me see. Next we have, and I did manage to get the name of the book up. Are you aware of a starting point hosted by Chris Evans? And would you consider being a guest on his platform to get these nudges out to the public of like-minded people seeking a way out of toxic polarization?
I don't know this. Is this a podcast? I'm not sure. I don't know this program.
And if I could multitask effectively, I'd Google that right now. So maybe somebody could put that in the chat.
Okay.
No, I'm not familiar with it either. A starting point hosted by Chris. There's one new message. Maybe they said something. Hold on. Oh,
And I will say I'm very open to talking about the ideas, the possibilities, the nature of the problem, which I think isn't well understood, of what I call toxic polarization, and the insights from science about how to break through it. So I'm very eager to talk about it as often as possible.
And actually, this is another question that I was wanting to ask myself. How can we make people want to find common ground?
Well, research, you know this research on something called ripeness theory tells us that when you have groups that hate each other, that are fighting each other, that are warring against one another, there are a couple of conditions that lead to them agreeing to come together and talk. And one of them is that they're miserable, that they're sufficiently miserable and in pain, and they see the other as miserable and in pain. And the good news is Americans are miserable.
93%, you cite the statistic. Not your statistic. But
there's a study called War in Common. They measure polarization here, and they've identified what they call the exhausted middle majority. These aren't the extreme people that are controlling Twitter and the social media sphere, but they're everybody else who feels fed up, tired of dysfunction in Washington and the hate and vitriol on the news, and who are really looking for something else. And that's promising, because that's what we're looking for. That's why I wrote this, because this is an opportune time. Look at the Great Resignation, right? Every month, 4 or 5 million people are saying, I'm not going to go back to that job anymore. It's toxic for me. Well, this is a time when people are saying, I don't want to do something anymore. It's toxic for me.
And you also talk about crisis. Crisis makes those 93% who are exhausted. It creates opportunities. And so we have a lot of crises right now. I mean, between the pandemic and between the January 6th and between now with Ukraine, I mean, I'm getting chills. Wow. So it is a time of opportunity. It's a
very destabilizing time, which is very hard for many people, and an opportunity to regroup.
Make some different choices. Absolutely. And so all of the things that we've talked about, which is working with the groups on the ground and making individual choices about what I'm going to do and what I'm not going to do, how I'm going to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. So many different things that we've talked about tonight. Let's see, do you have which approach to change would be helpful in bringing meaningful change? Do you have any vision of what approach to change would be helpful in bringing meaningful change? I think we've talked a lot about that so far.
I mean, the one thing I can elaborate on that we haven't talked in detail about is there is a chapter in the book about movement. And I use that because, again, in our field of peace building, mediation, negotiation, we usually bring people together who are in conflict and ask them to sit down and talk to each other. And most of the time that's great and sufficient and useful. But when the differences are really in our neurological structure, in our media spheres, in our families, in our sense of loyalties and passions, it's insufficient. And under those conditions, what my colleagues have identified and neuroscience research suggests is that movement helps. When people get up physically and work together, or even simply just, what I do in my life is if I'm having a tense relationship with someone and I know sitting down is just going to make it worse, I say, would you go for a walk with me outside? Ideally outside, side by side, you walk together. And there's something physiologically that happens where our mirror neurons start to connect, and it fosters a sense of empathy and compassion for one another and a sense of cooperation. And there's all kinds of research on this, but it's just a trick to help you.
I love that. It's so simple and basic and yet really profound.
Really profound. And there are people, going for walks and at summits that lead negotiators do. There's a thing called the Abraham's Path that Bill Urey and others set up, which is a trek across multiple nations in the Middle East, the MENA region, where they encourage kind of interdenominational treks together. Those processes tap into the value of moving physically outside together with one another.
It's wonderful. Somebody asked, is there a toolkit for small communities to reduce polarization among its citizenry?
There are many, but again, what I would point you to are the groups that are doing that and that put those toolkits out. So Essential Partners is one out of Cambridge that I'm very familiar with. Braver Angels is another one. Search for Common Ground is another one. There are many of these groups that are working in your community right now that have these tools and know how to do them. Again, you know, what I offer in the book is at the end, this sort of set of ideas or nudges that you can use in your own life. But if you really want to do this work at a community level or organizational level, then find the people that know how to do this, that have done it well, that have shown that they know how to do this well, and learn from them, engage with them. That's the biggest recommendation I would make.
Well, and Peter, I know I'm facilitating a conversation with you, and so obviously I'm going to tell you I like your book. But I have to tell you, I really, really like this book because it really has very specific things that we can be doing immediately. And so it's not a theory. It's, you know, that's one of the reasons why I'm so glad this is, because as you said, your academic stuff, you know, only 12 people are reading. Yeah, 12 people are reading that, and they're all in the field. So I highly, and I hope it comes out in paperback soon. So I think the book is a toolkit, and I like the fact that it's framed that way. So I have to say that there's somebody in the audience that wants to ask a specific question. She says her name is Beatrix Erickson, and she says, can I ask a question directly? I'm a Black woman living in Reading and have a question to ask that is too long. Have a question that is too long to ask. And so I've given permission for her to be unmuted.
Okay.
If that's okay with you.
Sure.
Beatrix, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes,
yeah.
Can hear you.
Thank you so much for this very informative talk. I have enjoyed it so thoroughly. And I am so grateful to you for talking about Watertown. I didn't know about Watertown, but I have to tell you that I've lived here since 2006. And in that time, like last year, I made a commitment to sort of get to know other Black families in the town and see what do we want. And one of the things I came away with is the majority, if not all of us, are interested in having this community be more reflective of a Watertown. We have no desire to have the national discourse be brought down to our towns. We want to have that coffee. We moved here knowing exactly what the town dynamics were. Yeah. And our hope was just to have exactly what you said about Watertown happening. Yeah. And my question is, or actually, I don't know if it's so much a question as a comment or a struggle, because I've heard this from you know, there's not a whole lot of us here, but enough of us in terms of like us being heard. Sometimes it's a challenge for those who are in the fight with us to understand that how we may think differently. It's one thing if you're a Caucasian person and you want to help out in this discourse, but for those of us who are people of color, we have a multi-dimensional view of these issues, in that not only do we have opinions, but we have to survive within them. Yep. And so my question to you is, how can we get these allies, people who really want to help, to listen? Because what a lot of families have said to me is when they say something different from what the perception is, it's almost like they're looked at with glazed eyes almost. Yeah. And how do we partner up with our allies to ensure that our beautiful, wonderful community is one that is more reflective of the description you have of Watertown, and that keeps the national discourse at bay and just has us looking at each other one-on-one over a cup of coffee and just talking, because that's why I moved here.
Well, thank you for that question. It's a fantastic question, or series of questions, I guess I would say. And let me just respond by saying that one of the things I hear you say, so there's a if I can quickly, there's a great research study that's done on dialogue. It was done by a man named Emile Bruneau, who was a neuroscientist. And he studied Israelis and Palestinians and immigrants and citizens in Arizona, illegal immigrants and citizens in Arizona, and in dialogue. And what he found is that, so two things happen in real dialogue processes. One is that people are able to tell their story and be heard. The other thing is that someone hears your story. And what they found in the research is that attitudes for people in lower power positions, like Palestinians in Israel-Palestine, their attitudes were much more likely to change, and they were much more likely to feel connected to the other when they really felt they were genuinely heard. Those in high power, on the other hand, their attitudes change when they are able to shut up and listen. Because those in high power are used to being heard and attended to, and they're addicted to that. They expect that. It's when they're quiet and really take in the stories, the pain, the challenges, the wonders, the love of those in low power. That's what changes those in high power. So this is just one piece of science that would be an interesting thing to raise in a community like yours, where you say, A, we need to move into a process of dialogue, ideally that's facilitated, but B, because there are different kinds of effects that will happen here. And part of what maybe my community needs at this point is to first feel genuinely heard and taken in, right? So how to do that is a practical question. I would need to know more about your community and the challenges that you face. But again, I would urge you to go to the Bridging Divides Initiative website, to zoom in to your community and to see if there are groups already that are doing this well and doing this effectively, and to reach out to them to start. Because it might be that you have a cohort of folks that you could bring into that would greatly enhance what they're already doing. And so there could be mutual benefits. So I would recommend you start there. But if you find that problematic or not ineffective, reach out to me. My email is pc84@columbia.edu. Reach out to me and we'll talk more about it.
Thank you. And thank you, Beatrix, for your question.
Yeah.
One person is really encouraging looking at a starting point, saying that it would be a great organization to help you get the word out further, although I know you've done many, many interviews and will, I'm sure, continue to do so, but on your work. Are you familiar with that organization, A Starting Point?
A Starting Point? I'm not, no.
This person is actually saying that they want me to, even after the recording is over, to really say to you that it would be a great opportunity to get your best points out to the public. And they've provided a link, which is A Starting Point. And I'm sharing it because I also think other people might be interested too. www.astartingpoint.com, which I also will look into myself. So yeah. I decided to share that with everybody because I think it might, I will look into it myself as well.
Fantastic. That's useful. Thank you.
Well, so we have just a couple of minutes left. I have two questions for you. One, because I'm not getting any from there's one about the UN, but I think we've done a lot with the international arena. I wanted to ask you, which of your many accomplishments make you feel the most personally proud?
That's a hard question. Personally,
I wanted to ask you some hard questions.
I would have to say I work in different kinds of domains around different kinds of challenges, and I grew up in Chicago in the 1960s, and it was a time of a lot of tumult and violence and a nonviolent civil. King showed up there at some point and was mobilizing a nonviolence resistance campaign. And so race and race relations, I went to a Catholic school that was one of the first desegregated schools And so the issues of race relations in America, which are one of our original sins, is one of the ones that I think is the most important to me and to my heart. And so one of the things we've done here at the center is really work on trying to understand how, why is it that work in communities and institutions on what we call diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, and justice, why is that work so slow, so hard to make progress on, and so hard to stick and sustain? And so we've been trying to use insights from complexity science and mathematics and studying systems that do change. And we've done a fair amount of work, and that's translated recently in the last few years to real practical work on the ground, where we're working with institutions who are really committed to doing this and really affecting what we think is sustained change. So racial relations, racial conflict, racial healing. I'm working with a group that's trying to do a sort of social media truth and reconciliation process. So my work in race relations, I think, is probably some of the most personally important to me. And so I've been applying what I learn and apply in other areas to that work, now consistently for 10 or 15 years. But it's starting to pay off, I think, in good practice.
And so that maybe highlights my final question, although if there's any other questions from the audience, we do have a couple more minutes. So what's next? And I know you've done so much that maybe that's a harsh question. Maybe what's next is a walk on the beach or something.
Yeah, well, that sounds really good right now. I am definitely tired. And again, I have other projects that are ongoing. The Sustaining Peace Project. I have a large project on this adaptive mediation work, and we'll probably do a book from that. And there's work that we do on cross-cultural differences. And then this diversity work, this DEIA work, all of those things are thriving research and practice areas. I have to say that I'm still acutely worried about this country. And I feel like I'm going to spend the next 2 to 4 years until the next 2 elections, doing everything I can to try to reduce vitriol, build bridges, find ways to re-engage the exhausted middle majority in our democratic process that's constructive. Because I feel like if things get a lot worse here, violence will spike, and it will be a game changer, not only for the US, but for the world. We are such a beacon for the world, despite all of our flaws. And so right now, this is where most of my energy is, although those other things I mentioned are very important other areas I work in.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I want to thank you, because the work that you're doing is really so essential. The work on peaceful societies, the work on, how to, I personally thank you, because it's so essential right now. And I can't even imagine how exhausted you must be. I've looked at, some of your interviews and think how many has he even done? So I personally thank you for your contributions to making our country a safer place to live. And I think we're very close. So I want to thank the library community again for this wonderful program, and the Reading League of Women Voters, whose work is so essential. And again, I really appreciate this opportunity. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, Averell, thank you so much. You did a fantastic job at shepherding this and multitasking and getting questions in, and you did a fantastic job, and I appreciate all the generosity of your comments and your support. So thank you so much. It was fun to spend some time with you like this.
Absolutely.
Hopefully I'll see you in Syracuse soon.
Yes, that would be great. Absolutely. Okay. On a warm spring day, I hope.
Me too.
And on behalf of the Mark Twain Library, thank you so much, Dr. Manes and Dr. Coleman. It was a very enlightening conversation. And thank you so much to everyone who attended tonight, and especially to those who asked such wonderful questions. Thanks.